All right, so we're going to take a look at a couple of ways that the media exercises its influence in politics. And so we're going to focus on how the media controls the agenda and how the media evaluates candidates. So, first, we'll focus on agenda control. So, we want to talk about how the media influences which subjects we, the people, think are the most important things for the government to deal with. And we see a great example here. Um, Surely, at this point, we all recognize Dr. Anthony Fauci on the right. He is an infectious disease expert that serves the federal government. And this is a person that has been in the news a lot over the last year. And that is a choice that the media makes when deciding which news stories are the most important to cover. And so, because he's on the news so often, people are more likely to focus on news coverage of the COVID pandemic. So, first, let's make sure we're on the same page about what the agenda means. When we talk about the public agenda, we're talking about the lists of like issues or topics that the people think the government should be dealing with. We talk about the most important things. We describe them as being like at the top of the agenda. So we kind of think of the agenda as like a to-do list, and the public and government officials try to influence like how high on the list certain topics get. Government officials rely on the public for like their jobs, like the president and congressmen. They rely on the voters putting them back in office, and so it is important for government officials to pay attention to the issues that the public is the most concerned about, and that's their best chance at winning the most votes and being successful in the next election. So when the public demands that a problem be solved, government officials are very likely to listen to the public and at least try to do so because they want to show the public that they are paying attention to their concerns. Different media outlets like newspapers or TV channels or whatever, they make choices about which stories they're going to give a lot of attention to and which stories they're going to ignore. Um, if we think of like a news broadcast, like a 30-minute TV program, putting the stories first tends to make people think that they're the most important. Putting news stories on the front page of the newspaper, that's a decision that they make that helps influence what the public thinks. The public thinks that the story on the front page is way more important than the story on the fourth page. The first story on the TV news at night is way more important than whatever story they're covering 17 minutes into the news. So when the media make these choices about coverage of stories, they have a lot of influence over what the people think. When they continue to follow a story day after day after day, that shows that the media thinks this is a very important story. When the media ignores a story for a long period of time, it shows that this is a story that the media doesn't think matters that much. It doesn't think it has a lot of impact on the public. So, for example, our picture here, like especially something like climate change. Climate change will go through periods of time where it gets a lot of attention, other times where it's ignored. It doesn't mean that the problem itself is any different, but the people will surely think that the problem is more or less important to solve right now based on how much news coverage they see of something like this. Controlling the agenda is so important because this helps determine what issues the government is going to deal with. Like this, a lot of news coverage on something is going to make government officials speak out, let their opinions be known, try to solve this problem. This also has a lot of control over which candidates win elections. If in the 2020 election cycle, the media spent most of the time talking about the coronavirus pandemic, which is something that President Trump did not handle very well, instead of focusing on economic growth, which President Trump did a pretty good job of. That had a tremendous influence over how voters voted. So, agenda control can impact which candidates win elections. And it can also impact how many voters turn out and participate in elections. So, when the media focuses on stories, certain stories may motivate people to go out and vote. And if the media were to make different choices, people may be less attentive to the election and not show up and participate. And when we think of agenda control, it's important that we understand that it's not always like the media making a decision because they're like, we want to influence the agenda. In some cases, these are deliberate decisions. Like the media might decide, a particular channel or newspaper might decide, we want to focus on climate change all the time until people understand how important it is. But other times, the media is more, we got to remember that they're all businesses. They're all for profit businesses and they want to make a profit. And so a lot of times the choices that they make are just an effect of what stories are popular with people anyway. So maybe they cover the coronavirus pandemic because that's why people are turning into the news and things like that. So the choices aren't necessarily because they want to make sure that this gets the attention of government officials, but maybe they're just doing what the most people are going to watch. So just to put this into like a real context here, just a couple of like breakdowns of media coverage here. On the left, we see how much attention in the media was spent on several topics here, like fires in California, COVID-19, the economy, climate change. I don't even know who Scott Morrison is, but here we see that coronavirus is getting a lot of attention, and then all of a sudden, late February, early March, it dominates news coverage. It's getting 80% of all news coverage devoted to COVID-19. And by the middle of the summer in early June, there it finally dipped to just below half of all coverage. But you see, like here, the media is making choices to influence what the people think is more important. Over on the left, we see how the media, the way that it portrays things, can have a lot of impact over voters here. So this is just coverage of protests against police violence, and then they polled people based on what news channel or what news source they chose to get their news from here. And so people who chose to get their news from Fox News were more likely to describe the protests as violent. People from MSNBC, CNN were more likely to describe the protest as peaceful protest. CBS, a broadcast network, there people were kind of evenly split between violent, peaceful, and both. And so here, the way the media chooses to tell stories have tremendous impact over voters. Just a couple more glances at how media choices impact people, or how we can see them exercising control of the agenda. Um, we talked about how media, they're often going to choose what they think the most people will watch, even if that's not necessarily the most important thing on the list of all news events. So we see that on the left here, where all three of these cable news channels have chosen to devote a lot more coverage to Trump being upset about NFL player protests. Certainly, like an issue that people care about, but like doesn't really have an impact on anyone's life the way that wildfires in California do. They have an impact on 40 million people's lives in California and in the surrounding areas there. So the wildfires are definitely a more important story, but these news channels choose to spend more time on things where they think that they can attract more viewers. So if they think like this conflict between Trump and the NFL players will attract more viewers, they'll spend time on that. If they think that not that many people are going to watch coverage of the wildfires, they're not going to spend a lot of time on it. On the other side there, we see how channels make different choices, and these are cable channels. We'll talk more about them later, but in just 1 week in October in 2017, we see how Fox News as a channel decided to spend a whole lot more of their news coverage on immigration issue than CNN or MSNBC. So we'd likely see polling of people who watch that channel as their main news source. We'd likely see that they think immigration is the most important issue that the government deal with, and CNN and MSNBC viewers may think other issues are more important than the immigration issue. So just some examples of how the media make choices and how that can influence what people will think that the government ought to do. Another way that the media has a whole lot of influence over politics is they play an important role in what we call candidate evaluation. So, the way that they cover specific political candidates has a huge impact over how voters are going to react to those candidates. So, for example, here, definitely not an important story for the news to cover, but the news wants to cover a story where former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, describes Ted Cruz as Lucifer. And so, when that is a story in the news, that impacts how people feel about a government official like Ted Cruz. So, when we talk about candidate evaluation, we mean that the media makes choices about how it covers particular candidates. This works two ways. They make choices about which candidates they're going to cover, and they make choices about which stories they're going to focus on. So, when they make choices about which candidates to spend a lot of time on, that influences the voters because it makes the voters think that their candidate is realistic, has a realistic chance at winning or not. These choices can like really impact a candidate's chances of winning an election. So a candidate who is like barely getting any coverage on the news, on TV, or in newspapers, voters are not going to think they have a realistic chance of winning. But a candidate who the news focuses on every day, that is a realistic candidate, and the voters will be more likely to give that person their vote. On the left here, we see a Trump town hall special on NBC News. So, like NBC, if there are 17 different candidates running for the Republican nomination, they're not going to give 17 of them their own show to sit there and talk to voters. But the choices that they make help impact what voters think about that candidate's chances of winning. Obviously, the media can't give equal time to every candidate in the race. So they make choices, and they make choices based on who they think has a real chance of winning. If the media outlets think someone has a real chance of winning, they're going to get a lot of coverage. And those candidates that don't have a realistic chance of winning are not going to get a lot of coverage. Choosing which candidates get covered gives a candidate a real chance of winning or not, even if like they're behind. Like for example, in the 2020 election, Joe Biden was getting in the early primaries, he was coming in fifth place or worse, but he was still getting a majority of the news coverage, and that helped his campaign continue to attract voters. In the picture here, this is the 2016 presidential debate, and they make choices about which candidates get on the stage and about which candidates are going to be in the center stage. So, since Donald Trump was somebody that would attract viewers to the channel, Donald Trump got put at center stage, and that leads other voters to believe that like he's the main candidate. So the way that the choices that they make and the way that they cover candidates has a huge impact on what voters think. The media outlets also make choices about how they want to cover a particular candidate. So, like, they'll decide what to focus on. If they want to focus on just appearances and speeches and things like that, they might focus on policies of a particular candidate, or they might focus on scandals. And this is a big thing here. So, when they focus on scandals, that has a huge impact on voters, right? In the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton, they focused on her email controversy more than any other thing about her, and that had a huge impact on how voters decided to make their choice. We have scandals in every presidential election, every election of any kind, probably, but like in the 2020 election, there were attempts by some media outlets to really focus on a controversy about President Biden's son. Other outlets decided that was not that important of a story, and it ended up being not a big issue for voters in the 2020 election. So when the media outlets choose to put a lot of emphasis on a scandal, that's really going to have a lot of impact on how voters feel about that candidate. We see how this works. This is just a breakdown of like the number of times a particular candidate was mentioned in news coverage here, and this is just from CNN. And so they broke down like how many times each candidate was mentioned, and this would definitely line up with how those candidates did in the polling. I mean, in the actual voting to a degree here. So you see a lot of candidates who get almost no mentions at all, right? Like just a few hundred mentions over the course of the election here. But we see Donald Trump getting, 90,000 different mentions by the TV network. And that certainly has a huge impact on how the voters felt about him. And they treated him like 2016 was not the first time that Donald Trump uh, started, entering into politics, but it was the first time that news organizations treated him like a realistic option. And so giving so much coverage to Donald Trump certainly had a lot of impact on how he was able to win the election in 2016. Here we see media outlets making decisions about how to cover candidates. This is just dealing with Hillary Clinton, but the kind of maroon purple line, that's focusing on coverage, like minutes that were about her ideas and her plans as president. And the blue bar represents how much time was devoted, how many minutes were devoted to her email controversy. Um, Ultimately, the email controversy is like not a controversy at all, because both President Trump and members of President Biden's administration have done the exact same thing with no news coverage at all, hardly. But here, this really impacted how Hillary Clinton performed in the election. You see that an overwhelming amount of news coverage was devoted to her scandalous emails. And so that definitely had an impact on how voters felt about her in the election. All right, so now we can focus on our bigly ideas. We can take a look at all the things we've talked about today, and we can remember the year that was 2017 when President Trump was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Here, I think this is just a really cool perspective, seeing when we see the president working at their desk in the Oval Office, what's actually going on there. What a silly amount of reporters can often be around for something like this. So we see a ton of media coverage here in the president's day-to-day business. After today, we want to make sure that we can explain how the media serves as a linkage institution. So, what does it do to link the people to the government? We want to make sure that we can compare the advantages and the disadvantages of both print and broadcast media. I think you guys will do a great job of that. That's pretty easy. We want to make sure that we can explain how the media exercises control over the agenda. And we want to explain how the media can play a huge role in candidate evaluation. All right, that's it for step one in our exploration of linkage institutions here. So we know what the media does. Now we're going to shift our focus. We're going to go back a little bit. We want to find out how the media and the government have interacted over time and how that is changing.